Tehran, 1979. The city throbbed with unrest, a living, breathing chaos of chants, footsteps, and distant explosions. Smoke spiraling upward in restless curls that swallowed the dim glow of streetlights. Windows rattled and fractured in bursts of fear. Faces twisted with hope, rage, and desperation. Flags changed hands overnight, a symbol of revolution in motion. And in the heart of it all, the American diplomatic compound rose like a silent sentinel, steel gates, bolted walls, impenetrable, holding within them men and women who had once walked freely, but now felt the weight of entrapment pressing upon their souls. Inside, hallways pulsed with quiet tension. Whispers carried through the air like fragile threads. Footsteps echoed without origin. Doors creaked and swung open as if by unseen hands. A typewriter clicked in an empty office paper, trembling as if someone invisible still typed. Shadows stretched impossibly long along the walls. The air vibrated with anticipation and dread. And outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the terror that lay within an entire world contained in silence. Keys vanished from desks. Letters disappeared. Whispers carried secrets faster than human voices. Shadows pooled in corners, shifting and stretching, almost alive. The ambassador paced consulting reports piled high, unanswered, fragmented, contradictory. Each glance toward the single window framed chaos outside, so tantalizingly close, yet impossibly distant. The building itself seemed to breathe, to watch, to judge, each floorboard holding memory of every step, every whisper, every heartbeat. And the tension grew thick, tangible, almost suffocating. Footsteps echoed through corridors at hours when no one walked. Doors swung on their own. Lights flickered and died in sequence. Photographs fell from walls, faces blurred, identities erased. Typewriters clacked in silence, leaving unfinished thoughts that seemed to linger in the air. The staff whispered, trying to rationalize the impossible, trying to convince themselves that shadows' movements and vanished papers were tricks of the mind. Yet each night brought new anomalies, new manifestations of fear, and the compound seemed to pulse with its own life. Outside, revolution surged like an unstoppable tide. Barricades rose overnight, overturned cars and burning fires punctuating the streets. Inside, time slowed. Meals were rationed, sleep elusive. Every glance and every pause carried weight. Desks held papers no one dared touch. Voices whispered of intruders, shadows, spies. And the building became both a stage and a living character, watching, measuring, breathing alongside its inhabitants. The boundary between human perception and the compound's consciousness blurred. Rumors became folklore. Doors opening without wind. Rooms that shifted when unobserved. Shadows that lingered longer than their source. The old janitor spoke of memories embedded in walls, of voices, trapped footsteps, following even when empty. Fragments of missing papers and contradictory reports confirmed a pattern, a motif beyond understanding, binding fear, memory, and space into a rhythm that only the building fully knew. And outside, Tehran continued its endless pulse, alive, indifferent, oblivious. Night deepened, thick and oppressive. Smoke, dust, and the scent of the unknown filled the corridors. Lights flickered across empty hallways. Shadows stretched impossibly. Photographs, shifted faces blurred. Typewriters clicked unbidden. Voices answered questions never asked. The anticipation pressed on every chest, every mind, every nerve. The building inhaled with them, exhaled with them, and time itself seemed suspended, stretched, warped, observed. Footsteps approached, then vanished. A lamp swayed through untouched. Documents appeared and disappeared. Staff questioned their sanity. Reports arrived fragmented, contradictory, incomplete. Phones rang to static voices replaced by silence. And the compound breathed alive. Patient. a silent participant in a drama of fear and uncertainty, while the streets of Tehran continued their chaotic rhythm, indifferent to what unfolded behind walls of steel concrete and dread. Windows framed shadows that vanished when confronted. Staircases creaked without movement. Typewritten notes surfaced where none had been placed. Conversations ended abruptly. Questions remained unanswered, hanging in the air. The compound exhaled and inhaled with the trapped staff, each hour folding into the next with an oppressive rhythm. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the tension that had coalesced into a living presence that enveloped every room, every desk, every whisper, every heartbeat. The ambassador consulted maps, cables, and reports, tracing paths for communication and escape. Outside, the city roared, unstoppable. Inside, each action became laden with consequence, every gesture pregnant with fear and anticipation. Walls seemed to lean closer, ceilings, lower floors shift beneath invisible weight. Voices echoed from abandoned rooms. The night continued in endless repetition. Each flicker, each footstep, each shadow a note in a symphony of tension. The compound's doors, halls, offices carried memory fragments of human experience, whispers of ghosts, intruders, and each night added another thread to a tapestry of fear, binding the living to the unseen, the past to the present. The walls had absorbed the essence of every breath, every shiver, every glance, leaving an atmosphere dense with dread and anticipation. Time stretched, suspended, and observed. The living and unseen existed side by side. Footsteps echoed in empty spaces. Lights flickered and died. Papers appeared and vanished. Every occupant questioned perception, sanity, reality itself. Hours and days unfolded into a continuous living nightmare. The compound existed as both cage and witness, silent participant in fear, uncertainty, and shadows. No release offered, no explanation given. Tehran outside moved on, unaware of what lingered within the walls. Tehran, 1979. A city alive with chaos, a compound sealed by steel, a repository of fear, whispers, shadows, and memory, voices trapped, footsteps lost, letters unread, typewriters idle yet active in presence, every hour heavy with dread, every night stretching the limits of endurance. And the nightmare far from over resonated outward, leaving echoes lingering in memory, and in the walls themselves silent witnesses to a story half told, waiting, always waiting, for the world to notice. November 1979. Tehran lay under a sky heavy with smoke and the distant glow of fires. Streets lined with rubble, overturned vehicles, and barricades built overnight. The scent of dust, burning wood, and uncertainty hung thick in the air. American diplomats and embassy staff were trapped inside their compound walls of steel and concrete, holding them from the chaos beyond, yet offering no true safety. Every step outside was unthinkable, every glance toward the city a reminder of the storm that raged beyond. Inside, faces were tense, eyes flickering between fear and calculation. Each person aware that every word, every gesture could ripple outward into consequence. The ambassador moved from office to office, maps spread across tables, telegrams piled high, unanswered, the weight of responsibility pressing against his shoulders. He felt the pulse of revolution in every heartbeat. The streets of Tehran were alive with fervor chants and the roar of engines, yet also haunted by rumors and whispers. The locals spoke of strange happenings, of omens in the wind, of shadows that lingered too long, or figures that appeared only in peripheral vision. Newspapers carried reports of protests, arrests, and clashes with the military. Yet within the embassy walls, each report was dissected, questioned, sometimes doubted. Cables sent to Washington vanished into silence. Voices on the other end of the line remained disconnected. The very act of communication became a gamble, a thread stretched over a chasm of uncertainty. Every hour measured not by time but by tension, by the weight of what might come next, an echo of fear reverberating through each room. Staff moved cautiously through hallways, aware of every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, every shadow that seemed to move independently. The janitor whispered of doors that opened when no one approached, of floors that creaked with unseen weight of objects that shifted position, as though the building itself remembered every action. Windows showed glimpses of chaos outside, but each view carried a sense of distance, of something tantalizingly close, yet impossible to reach. Conversations were hushed questions left incomplete. Rumors of spies, insurgents, and mysterious intruders flowed alongside more mundane concerns of rationed meals, sleep, and the management of dwindling supplies. Every detail mattered, and yet some details could never be explained. Evening brought a different rhythm. The glow from street fires cast long, flickering shadows across walls and ceilings. The staff counted hours in whispers, monitoring movements outside, noting patterns in the protest, the absence or presence of military patrols. Every sound was amplified: the distant clatter of boots, the creak of a door, the sigh of wind through the compound's latticework. Objects that should remain still shifted. Typewriters clicked without hands. Paper rustled on desks. Staff exchanged glances, trying to convince themselves they were imagining what could not be rationalized. The city beyond the walls throbbed with life and unrest, while inside time stretched thin, bending under the weight of fear. Each office, each hallway became a repository of information, memory, and anxiety. The ambassador and his aides pored over maps, planning possible escape routes, noting the location of street patrols and identifying points of vulnerability. Yet every plan was speculative, a shadow of hope against the unpredictability outside. Reports from the field arrived, incomplete fragments of intelligence pieced together, like a puzzle with missing sections. Sometimes information contradicted itself, leaving more questions than answers. The sense of being observed persisted not just by human eyes, but by something larger, something intangible. The building itself seemed to hold the rhythm of events, a silent sentinel marking time, watching breathing, alongside its inhabitants. Rumors inside mixed with folklore. Stories whispered of doors that opened when no wind passed, of shadows that lingered in corners long after their origin vanished, of voices carrying messages not intended for the living. The janitor recalled tales from previous occupants of incidents that could not be explained by logic. These stories threaded through the staff's consciousness, blending fact with fear and creating a tapestry where reality and legend intertwined. The compound became more than a fortress. It became a living organism, absorbing tension, amplifying whispers, marking each heartbeat. And outside Tehran continued its chaos, unaware of the living history enclosed within those walls. Night deepened, carrying the scent of smoke dust and something indefinable. The city's glow filtered faintly through compound windows, creating pools of light that shifted and danced across corridors. Photographs lining the walls seemed to blur, in the dim glow, faces losing definition. Typewriters clacked in empty offices, leaving unfinished messages that trembled with urgency and uncertainty. Footsteps echoed through hallways when no one walked, and the staff could not distinguish between the natural rhythm of fear and the impossible. Each moment stretched longer than reality, and the building itself seemed to inhale and exhale with them, tracking, recording, remembering. The ambassador's office became a focal point, a center of plans, communications, and hope. Maps were marked, telegrams, drafted messages sent into silence. Every decision carried weight, yet the outside world was unresponsive. Beyond the gates, the city roared with revolution unstoppable. Inside, every action resonated gestures pregnant with consequence, moments of indecision amplified. Walls leaned closer, ceilings seemed lower, floors shifted under invisible pressure. Subtle, insidious, almost sentient. The staff moved cautiously, aware that the very architecture could impose its own rhythm on their lives, a pulse that dictated tension, fear, and anticipation. The compound's corridors carried history memory and an almost tangible anxiety. Voices whispered of intruders, ghosts, and unknown observers blending with mundane concerns of food, water, and rest. Every night added new layers to this atmosphere of uncertainty. Doors moved without cause. Shadows lingered beyond the range of vision. Typewriters continued to click in silent offices. And yet, despite all the impossibilities, the staff moved forward, calculating, observing, surviving. The boundary between what was human and what was beyond comprehension blurred, leaving an awareness that this place existed simultaneously in fact and legend. Footsteps echoed, lights flickered, papers shifted, and the rhythm of uncertainty pressed on the staff's minds. Time was no longer measured in minutes, but in moments of fear and tension. Every whisper, every movement, every glance could contain meaning or threat. The building itself seemed to remember to respond, to participate in the narrative, holding the trapped occupants in a constant dialogue with the unknown. Outside, Tehran's chaos continued unabated, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding behind walls of steel and concrete. Each moment inside a test of patience, endurance, and awareness. Inside the compound, every day was meticulously recorded in logs, notes, and private diaries. Officers and staff documented the passage of time, meals, and movements. Yet even these seemingly mundane details were laced with tension. Reports of visitors, strangers, or unusual activity were marked with cautionary notes, warnings that sometimes contradicted each other. Telegrams sent to Washington often went unanswered. Replies that came were delayed, fragmented, and sometimes unintelligible. The uncertainty created a suffocating atmosphere where trust was scarce, and every new piece of information was dissected, analyzed, and questioned. Official documents spoke of singular occurrences and fate, unknown language that seemed clinical yet carried the weight of dread. The staff recorded every anomaly. Doors found open when locked, papers moved. Objects vanished, yet were told to remain calm and continue their duties. Cables sent and received documented only fragments of the larger picture. Names of key personnel appeared, disappeared, or were redacted. The ambassador's diary, preserved in part, spoke of restless nights, rationed meals, and a constant calculation of risk. Security logs indicated multiple failed attempts to enter the compound by unknown individuals, yet the details were vague. Reports noted unexplained footsteps, sudden noises, and shadows observed in hallways without source. These notes, marked with the language of official restraint, hinted at a deeper anxiety. The staff's personal journals confirmed the sense of watching, always watching, sometimes by human eyes, sometimes by something beyond comprehension. Interviews conducted years later with surviving staff corroborated some of these anomalies. The recollections spoke of doors that seemed to close on their own, of corridors that felt longer than reality, of noises that did not match any known source. Every observation was cross-checked with logs, reports, and communications, yet many contradictions remained unresolved. Some telegrams arrived too late to be useful, others never arrived at all. In one case, a confidential report of an incident outside the compound disappeared from the archives entirely, leaving only notes indicating the incident had occurred, but no further details. The pattern of missing information created a palpable tension, an ever-present reminder of the uncertainty surrounding every action. Security reports detailed the rationing of food, the monitoring of communications, and the strict protocols enforced to maintain order. Yet even within these documents, staff noted anomalies. Supplies that were recorded as delivered sometimes did not appear. Correspondence between departments occasionally contradicted itself. The language of these reports was precise, clinical, yet the subtext revealed a level of anxiety that no document could fully conceal. The observation of every minute event became an act of survival, a ritual performed in the shadow of uncertainty. And each log entry, each memo, each notation added to the growing sense that something was not only amiss, but perhaps impossible to explain. The ambassador's private notes reflected the strain of leadership under uncertainty. Mentions of sleepless nights, rationed meals, and calculation of risk were interspersed with observations of the staff's behavior. Patterns emerged. Staff, who had been calm during the day, were restless at night. Some reported seeing shadows moving independently, typewriters clicking in empty offices, reports of missing items, all noted with careful, restrained language. These notes reveal the human element behind the official record, the fear, the anticipation, the constant effort to maintain composure under impossible circumstances. Eyewitness accounts compiled after the events described a building that seemed left, footsteps on empty floors, doors opening and closing without cause, typewritten messages appearing in offices where no one had been. And yet each anomaly was recorded with the same meticulous care as any official event. Newspapers from the period corroborated some details of the protests outside. Clashes, barricades, arrests, gunfire, all documented, creating a stark contrast between the chaos outside and the measured records inside. The combination of fact and folklore began here, blending the tangible with the inexplicable. Archived cables illustrate the tension of diplomacy under siege. Words carefully chosen, phrases coded with ambiguity. Requests for assistance, clarification, and confirmation often went unanswered. Some messages were returned marked undeliverable, others never reached their destination. The staff relied on these fragments to reconstruct plans and decisions, yet the gaps left a persistent uncertainty. Every message received or lost carried consequences. The logbooks reflected this, noting each attempt, each failure, each success. The compound became a repository of partial truths, a place where every document hinted at the unseen forces shaping events. Medical and personnel logs added another layer of fact. Notes about illness, stress, and exhaustion were meticulously maintained, yet they also hint at psychological strain. Entries mentioned trembling hands, sleepless nights, and an inability to eat or rest properly. While framed as routine medical observations, the tone reveals a deep anxiety permeating the compound. These personal effects, combined with official records, create a fuller picture of life under siege, a mixture of protocol fear and the slow erosion of normalcy. Daily logs noted the pattern of protest outside, frequency, intensity, direction. Yet inside, staff recorded subtle anomalies, footsteps where none should exist, objects misplaced, sounds that could not be explained. Each entry meticulously dated, each observation cross-referenced. In some cases, conflicting reports were reconciled only by acknowledging the unknown. These facts, however mundane they appeared on the page, gained a weight that transcended the official record. They were fragments of reality, tinged with the inexplicable. The archival record also revealed moments of contradiction. Reports of visitors denied entry, yet doors found open. Notes of absence when someone was present. These inconsistencies, preserved in logs and diaries, suggested not only human error, but also the presence of anomalies beyond standard explanation. Every contradiction was documented, every missing piece noted. And the staff, aware of the limits of their knowledge, continued to record, continued to observe, continued to survive. Photographs, some now preserved in archives, show empty offices, halls, and courtyards. Sometimes objects appear shifted between images. Shadows fall in impossible ways. Yet these visual records were treated as fact, annotated with dates, times, and captions. The images alongside logs, telegrams, and diary entries build a multi-layered record, a chain of evidence that is at once convincing and enigmatic. It is in this interplay between the tangible documents and the strange, unexplained occurrences that the fact layer begins to blur into the edges of legend. The combination of reports, personal diaries, and archival evidence forms the backbone of what can be verified about the siege of the compound. Yet each document carries traces of tension, of fear, of anticipation. Even the most mundane note rations delivered, logs checked, security patrols recorded, acquires a spectral weight when considered in the context of missing information, unexplained phenomena, and the relentless pressure of uncertainty. The fact layer, precise and clinical, becomes the lens through which the human experience, the anxiety, the vigilance, the dread can be understood. Inside the compound, the ordinary became extraordinary. Shadows stretched along the walls in ways that seemed to breathe. Whispers moved through corridors with no discernible source. Doors creaked open slowly, then closed, though no one approached. Papers rustled across desks as if invisible hands were rearranging them. Typewriters clicked intermittently in empty offices. Footsteps echoed along hallways where no one walked. And the staff, already tense from the siege, began to sense a presence that was both watchful and patient, lingering in the corners, observing, waiting. Stories began to circulate, soft and urgent, told in hushed tones during brief moments of respite. Of figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, black-cloaked shapes pacing corridors in silence, of lights flickering in rooms long abandoned, of objects shifting position between one observation and the next. A piano in an empty room reportedly played a single note. The wind carried faint cries that were never fully audible, and the compound became a stage for stories that blurred the line between reality and imagination, where fear and folklore intertwined seamlessly. Some staff whispered about the memory of walls, that the building itself remembered every step, every gesture, every word spoken, that it retained the imprint of anxiety, fear, and hope, that doors would open in recognition of movement, that hallways would elongate or shorten in response to unseen forces. The janitor spoke of previous occupants who vanished or experienced inexplicable events. Each tale grew in layers passed from one person to another. Rumors became accepted, knowledge fragments of truth mingled with legend, creating a haunting backdrop to the already tense environment. Evenings brought an altered rhythm. The glow from fires outside cast flickering shadows that seemed to move independently. Staff noted that corridors appeared longer at night, that ceilings seemed lower, doors narrower. A typewriter would clack a single sentence and stop words unfinished yet lingering in the mind. Footsteps traced across polished floors without source. Sometimes furniture shifted overnight. These anomalies, while unrecorded officially, were remembered vividly by those who lived them. And over time, the compound itself became a character, an active participant in the unfolding drama. Locals on the streets whispered of omens, crows, circling winds that shifted suddenly, and the sensation of being watched. Some said that the presence within the compound reached beyond its walls, that cries of distress could be heard in the alleyways at night, that shadows of the trapped diplomats stretched into the city like dark fingers. Superstitions mingled with fact, as stories of missing items, unexplained sounds, and ghostly figures became part of the collective memory. The line between what was observed and what was imagined began to blur, and a mythos grew around the siege, adding weight to every footstep and flicker of light. Staff began documenting these phenomena in personal diaries, noting shadows that lingered too long, noises that did not align with known sources, doors opening without cause. The act of recording became a ritual, a way to anchor reality amidst the surreal. Journals contained sketches of figures, notes of whispers, attempts to rationalize the irrational. Yet these entries only added to the legend, a tangible record of events that defied explanation. Each page carried fear, anticipation, and a sense of history repeating in cycles. One recurring motif emerged, the sense of eyes observing from places unseen, a presence in hallways sometimes felt, sometimes glimpsed, never fully seen. Staff spoke of feeling watched while performing mundane tasks, of papers sliding across desks without contact, of shadows that grew when noticed and receded when ignored. These stories spread quietly, building a folklore that ran parallel to the official records, and over time the compound's history became layered, one reality woven into another fact, into legend, memory, into myth. Even during daylight, the presence lingered. The air felt heavier, charged. Footsteps echoed from empty floors. Objects appeared to shift imperceptibly. Doors would remain slightly ajar after being securely closed. Staff whispered of a watcher in the walls, of a silent observer that recorded every movement, every hesitation. The folklore permeated the everyday, a quiet tension, threaded through every interaction. Reality and legend coexisted, each feeding the other, creating a story that could not be fully untangled. Reports from outside occasionally corroborated strange events inside. Distant cries matching whispers heard within the compound. Reports of shadows or shapes near the gates, sometimes dismissed by officials. The merging of fact and legend made the siege feel larger than its walls. A force unseen seemed to extend beyond steel and concrete, reaching into the streets. The city itself became a backdrop to the myth, amplifying the tension and fear, reinforcing the narrative that the compound was not merely a building, but a living entity. The night deepened, and the staff's perception sharpened. Shadows moved with intent. Doors shifted with purpose. Typewriters produced words that were never intended, and whispers carried meaning beyond comprehension. The building seemed to breathe, pulsing in sync with the staff's anxiety, responding to their fears and their hopes. Folklore intertwined with fact, the missing, the unexplained, the anomalous becoming a narrative that no document could fully contain. The compound was alive, a witness and a participant, and the city outside throbbed with unrest, oblivious to the life of legends within. Even in retrospect, years later, those who survived recalled moments that defied rational explanation. Shadows that lingered, voices that answered no question, objects that moved. Each memory was vivid, horrifying, yet indistinguishable from the reality of reports, diaries, and logs. The folklore layer had grown intertwined with the fact layer. Each informed the other, making the events of Tehran 1979 feel simultaneously historical and mythic. A siege not only of walls and gates, but of perception, of memory, and of the unseen. And as night stretched over the compound, the staff realized that the siege was not only physical, it was spiritual, psychological, and perhaps supernatural. The walls contained fear, the floors recorded footsteps, the shadows carried voices of the past and echoes of the future. Folklore and fact had merged into a single living narrative. Every whisper, every flicker, every shadow became part of the story, a story that would not end. A story that waited patiently, silent, eternal within the steel walls of Tehran. The walls of the compound had absorbed every footstep, every whispered word, every fleeting glance. And yet the unease inside was not isolated. Across history, patterns repeated. Diplomats trapped buildings, surveilled communications, disrupted. The motif of confinement, of observation of the unseen, appeared again and again, linking Tehran to distant times and places. Reports from previous decades surfaced in staff conversations. Stories of missing envoys in Europe, letters lost in transit corridors where shadows moved without source. The human mind tried to rationalize, yet each story mirrored the uncertainty and fear within these walls. In the archives, historians would later note similar situations where walls seemed to breathe, where time elongated, where reality itself was questioned. Each incident shared a signature, locked doors, vanished papers, footsteps that left no trace, voices echoing without origin. The staff sensed a connection across decades, a chain of events threaded together by something unseen, an invisible hand guiding, watching, and testing. And the notion of a pattern became a quiet obsession, a way to make sense of the impossible. The compound's residents noticed that the same phenomena repeated in cycles, shadows appearing at the same hour each night, whispers returning in familiar cadence, objects shifting in predictable ways. It was as though the building communicated through these repetitions, a language of fear and warning, of control and observation. And when the city outside erupted in protest or violence, the internal disturbances intensified, walls responding to external chaos. Patterns mirrored across continents, across time, where diplomats, soldiers, or civilians were isolated. Each story a note in a larger composition of mystery and dread. Even the most skeptical staff could not deny the similarities. Files from past conflicts recounted comparable phenomena: missing records, unexplained movements, corridors that seemed to twist. The world outside often ignored these details, yet those inside the walls felt the echo of history in every shadow, every creaking floorboard. And as the siege continued, the compound itself became aware of its place in this continuum, a nexus of observation, fear, and repetition. The human mind recorded the facts, while folklore whispered alongside them, each informing the other, blurring lines between what had happened and what might happen. The motif extended further. Diplomatic buildings under siege, military compounds, and wartime homes abandoned during uprisings. Each contained stories of footsteps that were never traced, doors opening without cause, letters disappearing, and whispers that answered no question. Staff inside Tehran's compound began comparing notes, drawing connections, recognizing the recurrence of this phenomenon. A collective memory formed, bridging past and present, and each anomaly took on deeper meaning, as though they were echoes of prior events repeating themselves in subtle, almost ritualistic ways. The city outside continued its unrest. The fires, the chants, the chaos. Yet the motif inside the compound grew stronger. Walls retaining memory, shadows growing bolder, whispers shaping understanding. The staff found themselves reflecting not only on the siege at hand, but on all instances where humans had been trapped, observed, and tested. And in these reflections, Tehran's events became more than a single historical moment. They became part of a continuum, a thread linking fear, isolation, and the inexplicable across time and space. Legends circulated quietly among staff, of buildings that watched, of halls that remembered, of shadows that carried intent. They compared experiences to historical reports, finding resonance. The folklore was no longer just superstition. It was a lens through which they interpreted facts. The repetition of events, of anomalies, suggested a pattern beyond human comprehension, a motif that transcended geography and era, a silent observer woven into the fabric of each situation, marking its presence through absence, through gaps, through what could not be fully explained. In hushed conversations, the staff acknowledged the parallels, the fear, the tension, the unexplained movements, each story a reflection of another, the past bleeding into the present. Tehran was not alone in its anomalies. Other diplomats in other cities at other times had experienced similar disturbances, doors opening without cause, shadows stretching, impossibly objects moving unseen. And the recognition of this pattern lent both horror and strange comfort, a sense that they were part of something larger, something timeless yet incomprehensible. The bridge between fact and legend extended across continents. Cables from distant embassies recounted events that were eerily similar. Missing documents, unexplained noises, staff reporting shadows. Each account mirrored the current siege. And while history recorded facts with precision, folklore added the emotional, the human, the inexplicable. Together, they painted a picture of a recurring motif, a spectral thread connecting the Tehran compound to a lineage of fear, uncertainty, and observation. The motif manifested not only in physical spaces, but also in the psyche. Staff became hyper-aware, noting patterns in sound, movement, light. The building seemed to react, responding to the collective fear echoing past events. Historians later suggested that this recurrence was a human pattern recognition of motifs across space and time. But for those inside the walls, it felt as though the past was alive, whispering, shaping, guiding. And in that whisper, folklore and fact merged into a single haunting narrative. Even the mundane became portentous. The delivery of meals, the ticking of clocks, the distant roar of the city. Each event was framed by expectation, informed by historical echoes, amplified by legend. Shadows moved as if rehearsed. Objects shifted as though following unseen instructions. The staff documented, watched, and survived. Each observation became a link in a chain connecting Tehran 1979 to countless other moments where humans had faced the unknown. And in this chain, the motif persisted, patient, eternal, a quiet current beneath the surface of reality. And so the siege of the Tehran compound became both singular and universal, a moment in time, yet a reflection of recurring events. The motif of observation, isolation, and inexplicable phenomena linked history, folklore, and human experience. Inside, the staff lived in the shadow of past and future occurrences. Every shadow, every whisper, every shift in air became part of a larger rhythm, a bridge between fact and legend, between reality and myth. And as the city pulsed outside, the walls contained not only fear, but the echo of countless stories reverberating endlessly. Inside the compound, tension reached a point that seemed to thicken the very air. Footsteps echoed relentlessly down corridors where no one walked. Doors that had been secure moments before swung open without cause, then closed with a hollow bang. Papers vanished from desks as if lifted by invisible hands, only to reappear hours later in locations no one had placed them. Typewriters clicked sporadically in offices long abandoned, leaving behind half-formed sentences that trembled with urgency and fear. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along walls, curling and recoiling, as if alive, observing every movement, every breath. The staff exchanged anxious glances, their eyes wide, their hands trembling, aware that something beyond comprehension had taken root inside these walls. A journal left open on the ambassador's desk contained entries that had been meticulously recorded. Yet when a staff member returned hours later, pages were missing. Sentences, half-erased words crossed out, evidence of unseen tampering. Whispers spread quickly. Some claimed they heard voices answering questions they had never asked. Security logs contained contradictory reports. A guard observed a visitor in the East Wing, while cameras captured no one. Every detail contradicted the next, truth and illusion entwined, creating a suffocating uncertainty that gnawed at the staff's nerves. Even the most rational officers began to hesitate before moving through the hallways. The distant sounds of chaos outside the walls only heightened the unease. Gunfire punctuated the night, shouts of revolution echoing faintly, carried on the wind. Yet within the compound felt suspended in a different reality. Shadows moved independently of light sources. Lamps flickered in rhythmic pulses, and the temperature seemed to shift inexplicably from room to room. Objects slid across polished floors without contact. Doors opened slowly, as if acknowledging the presence of an unseen observer. and every creak of the floorboards became amplified into a signal of warning. The human mind strained to distinguish what was real and what was spectral. Footsteps approached offices where no one waited. The typewriter in the secretary's room clattered out a series of words, names, locations, warnings before falling silent. Letters disappeared from desks, only to appear in locked cabinets far across the compound. A photograph fell from a wall, faces blurred beyond recognition. Conversations became fractured sentences, unfinished questions left dangling. The atmosphere carried a weight so heavy it seemed physical, pressing against the chest, slowing the heartbeat, tightening the throat. And yet every anomaly, every whisper, every vanished object drew the staff deeper into the web of fear that had ensnared them. The ambassador's aides began reporting anomalies in a pattern that could not be ignored, shadows that lingered long after their source had vanished. Sounds of voices muttered, repeated sometimes in a different language. Keys turning in locks that had no doors. Footsteps descending staircases that led nowhere. And through all of this, the staff documented meticulously, recording what they observed, knowing that these records might be the only proof of the inexplicable. Yet each note added more questions than answers, more tension than reassurance. A sense of history pressing down through every floorboard, every wall, every beam of the compound. At night, the most disturbing events occurred. Lights flickered violently, casting the hallways into darkness. Shadows pooled unnaturally, forming shapes that appeared humanoid, yet distorted. Papers fluttered as if caught in invisible drafts. Doors slammed closed, echoing through the compound. A piano in the east wing played a single sharp note repeated 3 times. And in that moment, the staff realized that the siege was no longer only a physical confinement. It was psychological, spectral, an assault on their senses and their sanity. They moved carefully, hesitated, before each step, listening to walls and floors attuned to the building itself. Evidence of intrusion or of something beyond explanation continued to accumulate. A confidential document disappeared from the ambassador's safe. Letters marked urgent could not be found. Security reports conflicted with eyewitness testimony. Logs were erased, redacted, and altered in ways that suggested both human interference and something inexplicable. One aide swore a figure stood in the hallway, watching silently, only to vanish when approached. Another claimed they heard whispers calling their name from rooms they had just exited. The compound seemed alive, responding, testing, observing. And every anomaly added weight to a climax that had been building from the first day of the siege. By dawn, the tension had reached a crescendo. Staff moved with deliberate slowness, eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of light, every movement of air. Whispers echoed in rooms, long emptied typewriters clicked in sequences that no human hand could replicate. Objects shifted with impossible precision. Doors opened and closed in concert with the staff's movements, as if the building itself were orchestrating events. And in every glance, every gesture, every heartbeat, the realization dawned that what they faced was not simply a siege by humans. It was a siege of perception, of reality itself. Fact and folklore intertwined, creating a moment of climax that would linger far beyond Tehran, far beyond 1979. The steel walls still stand, silent witnesses to everything that happened. Footsteps, whispers vanished, papers, shadows lingering too long. The air carries memory. Light falls in shifting patterns. Each room holds a story. Each hallway echoes absence. The presence remains, watching, patient, eternal. Outside, Tehran pulses with life unaware. Fires burn, voices shout, chaos continues. Yet the compound holds its secrets. Shadows move, objects shift, typewriters click without hands. The line between reality and legend blurs. Fact and folklore intertwine. A story that cannot be fully untangled. Even years later, those who survived recall the sensation of being observed. Whispers answering questions never asked. Footsteps in empty corridors. The walls remembering each moment. The legacy of fear, anticipation, and the unexplained endures. The events inside were not only a siege of walls, but a siege of perception, of time, of the human mind. The motif repeats observation, isolation, the unseen. Echoes reaching beyond steel and concrete. A lesson written in silence and shadows. You have just glimpsed another classified story. Fragments of truth and legend intertwined. Some questions remain unanswered. Some shadows never leave. And the memory lingers, haunting, persistent. You've just heard another file from Classified History. If you want to uncover more, subscribe and step deeper into the archives, where mysteries wait and stories refuse to fade.